Wyoming Territory, late spring of 1872, the wind carried the scent of sage and ash through the broken town of Dry Creek when the cowboy rode in with blood on his coat and silence in his eyes. The town barely noticed him, the same way it had stopped noticing her. Zadie Granger hadn't spoken in nearly a year. Not since the day she buried her infant son behind the church, beside the elm tree that never quite bloomed right after the storm. Folks used to whisper about her how she stared too long at nothing, how she moved like she was trying not to wake a ghost, but even the whispers faded over time. She ran the boarding house her father had built, all alone now. The rooms stayed empty. The kitchen stayed cold. She swept the same floorboards every day, though they never got dirty. At night, she sat on the porch and watched the horizon like she was waiting for someone who forgot how to come home. That afternoon, the cowboy rode in on a buckskin horse with one bad leg and a saddle that had seen better years. He stopped in front of the boarding house, dismounted slow, and looked up at her. Zadie didn't move, he didn't speak, just tipped his hat and stepped up onto the porch. He had a scar under his right eye and a quiet steadiness about him, like the kind of man who took his time tying knots and never raised his voice to get heard. She studied him, arms folded. No words, he nodded toward the sign. "You got a room," she gave the smallest of nods. He followed her inside. She moved like a shadow, guiding him up the stairs, unlocking the second room on the right. She handed him the key, then turned to leave. "I'm Foster Callen," he said. "Just passing through." She hesitated, hand still on the doorframe. He added, "I'll keep to myself." She left without a sound. That night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled down from the mountains, rattling the windows. Zadie stood by the stove, staring at the cold kettle, her hands motionless. Her breath came shallow, like it always did when thunder cracked the same way it had the night her baby, Henry, got sick and she couldn't find the doctor in time. Upstairs, Foster sat on the floor beside his bed, sharpening a knife that looked more ceremonial than useful. He paused, head tilting, listening to the sudden silence below. He found her sitting on the floor beside the cold stove, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes glassy and far away. He crouched in the doorway, boots leaving prints on the dusty boards. "You all right?" he asked. She did not answer. He waited a long moment, then said, "Sometimes I have to ask even when I know the answer." Still, she did not move. "I lost someone too." Her gaze flicked to him. He saw it that tiny shift and sat down across from her, legs stretched out slow. "My wife," he said. 6 years ago. I was off fighting a war I stopped believing in halfway through. Took me too long to get back. When I did, cholera had already taken her." Zadie blinked once. Her fingers tightened, then loosened. He did not ask her anything, not her name, not her story. He only said, "I've been silent too." Something cracked inside her chest. She felt it like a thread pulled too tight, finally loosening. Her throat burned. Her eyes stung. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in 11 months, Zadie Granger parted her lips. His name was Henry. Foster did not flinch. He nodded, the smallest motion. "That's a good name." She looked down at her hands. "He cried all night. The doctor never came." The storm outside roared, but in the kitchen it quieted. "I buried her too late," Foster said. "Had to ride 3 days with her body wrapped in a blanket behind my saddle. There was no one left to help me dig." Zadie swallowed hard. "I dug his grave myself." They sat there in the hush between thunderclaps, the silence no longer sharp but shared. Over the next few days, Foster kept to his word. He stayed in his room mostly, cleaned his saddle, mended his boots, wrote letters he never mailed. But in the evenings, he came to the kitchen. Sometimes he helped carry firewood, sometimes he made coffee. He never asked questions. Zadie still barely spoke, but she did not flinch when he came near. She even handed him a fresh towel one morning, their fingers brushing for half a second. He looked at her, and something warm passed between them. One afternoon, he found her outside by the elm tree behind the church. She stood with her hand on the marker, fingers tracing the name carved into the wood. Foster stood beside her without a word. "I thought I was being punished," she said softly. "For something," He looked over at her. You were not. She turned to him. Then why him? I ask that same thing, he said. Every morning. Zadie's eyes filled, but she did not turn away. I stopped talking that day, could not find the use. You just had not found someone worth talking to yet, her breath caught. She looked at him like she was seeing more than a man, maybe something steady, something solid that would not shatter when she leaned on it. Foster reached for her hand. She let him take it. Neither of them said anything more. They did not need to. That night he stayed in the kitchen long after she went to bed, built the fire back up, scrubbed the pan she had left. When he turned to leave, he found her standing there in the hallway, barefoot and quiet. I cannot sleep, she said. He stepped closer. Me neither. She nodded once, then walked past him and sat at the table. He joined her. They talked until the fire burned low, about nothing and everything. About how he had worked cattle drives in Texas, how she had once dreamed of seeing the ocean. They did not cry, they did not touch. But something in the room shifted gentler now. Like grief had taken one step back and left space for something else to breathe. The next morning, Zadie made biscuits for breakfast. She set out 2 mugs without thinking. Foster came down, smiled when he saw the extra place. When he sat, she said, "You were right, talking does help." He looked at her, eyes soft. So does listening. They ate in silence again, but now it was warm like sunlight on skin after a long winter. Neither of them said where this was going, but they both knew. Late May brought the first hard thaw to the valley. Mud clung to wagon wheels and boots alike, and the river behind the church swelled against its banks. The boarding house roof leaked in one corner of the parlor, and Zadie had to set a tin pail under the drip. She didn't mind the sound. It gave the room a kind of rhythm. Foster had stayed on longer than he first said he would, but no one remarked on it. Zadie didn't ask, and he didn't explain. Every morning, he rose early enough to split wood before breakfast. She began leaving the axe leaned against the porch rail, sharp and waiting. One morning, she found him in the barn behind the house, tightening a new girth strap onto his saddle. He glanced up from his work. "You ever ride?" he asked. She stopped in the doorway. "Not in a long while." "Well," he said, brushing sawdust from his trousers, "you still got the shoulders for it." Zadie stepped closer, running her hand along the bay mare's neck. "That filly used to belong to my father. She's gentle, but she don't like loud noises or quick hands." "I'm neither," Foster said. That afternoon, they rode out past the edge of town where the cottonwoods grew thick and the sun caught on the leaves just right. Zadie didn't speak much, but she didn't ride behind him either. They kept pace side by side, the horses' hooves soft in the damp earth. At a quiet bend in the trail, she reined in. "I used to come out here with my mother. She'd gather wild mint along the creek, said it helped with nerves." Foster dismounted. "You still find any?" She nodded toward a patch near the water's edge, then swung down and crouched beside it. Her fingers moved carefully, breaking the stems low. He joined her, settling onto his heels. "Never met my mother," he said. "She died bringing me into the world." Zadie handed him a sprig. "Some things never stop hurting, even if you didn't know them long." He sniffed the mint, then tucked it into his pocket. "I think about what kind of woman she might have been. Whether she'd have liked the man I turned out to be." Zadie looked across the water. "Do you?" he thought for a moment. "Some days more than others." She didn't respond, but her gaze lingered on him a little longer before she stood and brushed off her skirt. That night, she lit a lantern in the dining room and brought out a deck of cards from the sideboard drawer. He raised one brow when he saw them. "I'm not much for gambling," he said. "No money," she replied. "Just something to do with our hands." They played a game she said her uncle had taught her. The rules were loose and the scoring didn't matter. Mostly they talked in fits and starts between rounds. He asked, "What did your father do before the war?" "Ran cattle, played fiddle." "Told lies about Texas women." Foster chuckled. "Sounds like a man I'd have liked." She dealt the next hand. "He died out on the winter range, fell from his horse, broke his neck clean." Foster's smile faded. "That's a hard end." Zadie stacked her cards. "He always said he'd rather die under the sky than in a bed." They played until the lantern burned low. When Foster stood to bid her good night, she didn't move from her chair, just looked up at him, something unreadable in her eyes. "Why haven't you left yet?" she asked. He hesitated. "Because this feels like the first place I haven't wanted to leave." She nodded once, then rose and walked him to the stairs. At the landing, she paused. "I think I'd like to keep talking," she said. "Then I'll keep listening." He didn't reach for her hand, didn't lean in. He just gave her a look that said he meant what he'd spoken, and she believed him. The days stretched longer. Foster helped repair the fence along the west pasture, and Zadie brought him water from the well without being asked. She began humming sometimes while she worked, just low enough that only the walls could hear. One evening he found her on the back step, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She didn't turn when he approached, but she didn't move away either. "I heard from the blacksmith," Foster said. "He can't fix the saddle tree, said it's cracked all the way through." Zadie nodded. "You'll need a new one then." "Means I'd have to ride into Laramie, might take 2 days." She looked out at the dark yard. "You planning to?" He sat beside her, knees bent, hands loose on his thighs. "Only if you want me to go." The silence after that stretched, but it didn't feel empty. She turned her head, met his gaze in the dusk. "I'd rather you stayed." He didn't smile, didn't speak. He only reached out, slow and sure, and brushed a bit of straw from her sleeve. She leaned into the touch, just a little. But it was enough. By early June, the cottonwoods thickened with green and the hills west of town turned soft with new grass. The boarding house, once quiet as an empty church, began breathing again, slow, steady, as if learning how. Foster built a clothesline behind the kitchen without being asked. Zadie watched him from the porch, arms folded, expression unreadable. When he finished, he glanced over. "You've got sunlight enough back here," he said. "No sense letting it go to waste." She stepped down the porch stairs and hung out linens the next morning. The smell of the sun in the fabric stayed with her through supper. On a Wednesday afternoon, she found a tin box tucked beneath the stairs while sweeping. Inside were sewing needles, a spool of blue thread, and a half-finished quilt square her mother had started before the fever took her. She brought it to the parlor and sat on the floor to mend the corner. The cloth was stiff with age, but the stitches remembered their way. She didn't notice Foster had come inside until she heard the kettle settle on the stove. "That yours?" he asked quietly. "My mother's," she said. He crouched beside her, careful not to touch the fabric. "You ever finish it?" She shook her head. "Didn't see the point." "Not after." Foster looked at her hands, how they moved with patience and purpose. "Looks like you're seeing it now." That evening, she served stew with cornbread and set the table for 2 without hesitation. Foster ate slow, chewing like he was thinking between bites. "This place," he said, "it doesn't feel hollow anymore." Zadie didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was steady. "I used to think grief was a room I'd never leave. Now it just feels like one I pass through when I have to." He met her gaze across the table. "You pass through it well." She looked down at her plate. "Not alone." The next day, she took the wagon into town for flour and salt. Foster stayed behind to patch the chicken coop roof. When she returned, she found the parlor windows open. The wind moved gently through the curtains, and somewhere outside, a bird sang. She stood there a moment, holding the sack of flour, and smiled without realizing it. That night, he brought 2 chipped tin mugs out to the porch. She joined him without her shawl, the air warm enough not to need it. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. "I used to," she said, "but I never could figure where I'd go." He took a slow sip. "I've been to a lot of places, never stayed long." She turned toward him. "Why not?" He set his cup down. "Didn't find anything worth staying for." The quiet between them stretched, but it held. She reached out, brushed a bit of dust from his shirt sleeve. "I didn't think I'd find anything worth staying for either," she said. He looked at her, eyes steady. "You think maybe we found it now?" She didn't answer with words. She leaned in, her shoulder barely touching his. He didn't move away. They sat like that until the moon rose. In the morning, he saddled the filly and brought her to the front steps. "You said she didn't like quick hands," he said, holding the reins loose. "But I think she knows me now." Zadie stepped outside, tying her hair back. She does, he offered the reins. Ride with me today. She didn't ask where, she just mounted and waited for him to join her. They rode out past the old trail, up toward the ridge above the river. The wind tugged at their clothes and the sun warmed their backs. At the top they dismounted and stood looking out over the valley. This land's changed, he said. How? Feels less empty. She turned to him. I think that might be us. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. They didn't speak again until they were halfway home. I've been wondering, he said. If I put down roots here, would you let me? She didn't hesitate. Yes, he nodded just once. Then I will. They rode the rest of the way back with no need to fill the air between them. The wind did that fine. That night he stayed past dark. She lit the lamp in the kitchen and set out 2 plates again. And that time, once the dishes were done and the fire banked low, she didn't walk him to the stairs. Instead, she reached for him. He pulled her close, slow and sure, like he'd been waiting for her to ask, and she had, without ever saying it. In the stillness that followed, she pressed her cheek to his chest. I didn't think I'd ever feel like this again, she whispered. He rested his chin on her hair. Me neither. Outside, the elm tree stood quiet in the dark. The wind didn't howl. The house held steady. And for the first time in a long while, both of them belonged somewhere. By mid-June, the clouds settled low and heavy, promising rain that hadn't yet come. The air held a stillness that pressed against the skin, like the land was holding its breath. Foster stood at the edge of the pasture, hands on his hips, watching the fence line. A section near the far corner had started to lean. He'd need another post and maybe 2 hours of daylight. He crouched, pulled off his gloves and ran a thumb along the splintering pine. Behind him, the sound of footsteps on wet grass. You'll want to check the east corner, Zadie said. There's a burrow running under it, ground's giving way. He turned. You've been walking the line. I walk most mornings, she said. Not far. Just enough to see what needs tending. He nodded once. You see more than most. I used to think I didn't see anything at all, she said. Foster looked at her, rainlight catching the edge of her jaw. You see what matters. She held his gaze. You always speak like that, he shrugged. Only when it counts. They walked the fence together in silence, her skirts brushing against the tall grass, his boots sinking into the softening dirt. At the broken post, she knelt and ran her fingers along the cracked wood. This one won't hold another storm. I figured the same, he said. She stood slowly. There's a cedar cut and stacked behind the barn. My father meant it for a gate that never got finished. That'll do, he said. I'll get to it before supper. She didn't turn back right away. You ever build anything that lasted? Not yet, he said. Zadie glanced at him, then nodded once and walked back toward the house. That evening, the wind picked up and the clouds finally gave. Rain came fast, drumming against the roof, running in thin streams down the windows. Foster stepped inside just before the worst of it hit, soaked through the shoulders, hat dripping. Zadie handed him a towel and he stripped off his coat near the door. She didn't ask about the post. He didn't mention it. They both knew it was done. He sat at the table and she brought him a mug of broth, steam curling into the dim air. You ever think of starting over? She asked, sitting across from him. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Thought about it every time I left a place. Why didn't you? Didn't trust what might follow me. Zadie folded her hands. You think it still would? He shook his head. Not anymore. She let that settle between them, listening to the rain shift against the windows. My sister wrote from Kansas last month, she said. Asked if I'd come out there, said there's work in the rail camps for someone who can cook. Foster's jaw tensed just slightly. You think you'll go? She traced the edge of the table with her finger. I wrote her back yesterday. Told her I found something worth staying for. He didn't speak right away. He just reached across and laid his hand over hers. I've been thinking about asking you something, he said. She looked up. I've got no land to speak of, no money past what I've saved under the floorboards. But I know how to build and I know how to stay if someone wants me. Her throat worked as she swallowed. I want to stay here with you, he said. Zadie didn't speak for a long moment. Then she rose and walked to the cupboard. From the top shelf, she pulled down a small tin dented, pale blue around the edges and opened it. Inside was a gold ring, thin and plain, worn smooth. She set it on the table between them. "My mother's," she said. Foster stood. "May I?" She nodded. He slipped it onto her finger, slow and careful, like she might still change her mind. But she didn't. Outside, the rain softened to a hush. Inside, the silence held no weight. Zadie stepped close, her hand still in his. "I think it's time I finished that quilt," she said. Foster smiled, the kind that reached into the tired corners of his face. "I'll help stitch. You don't know how. I'll learn." She leaned into him, and this time he closed his arms around her like he meant to keep them there. She rested her head beneath his chin, and the sound of his breath filled the hollow that used to echo inside her. The storm passed sometime after midnight, but neither of them noticed. The morning air carried the scent of wet earth and lilac. Zadie stood at the edge of the garden, hands stained with soil, planting the last of the summer beans. The sleeves of her muslin blouse were rolled to the elbows, and her braid hung heavy down her back. She didn't look up when Foster crossed the yard toward her, but she knew the rhythm of his footsteps now quiet, even, and she didn't flinch when he came to stand beside her. He crouched, picking up the seed pouch. "You always plant in rows that straight. My mother used to say crooked rows make crooked stew," she said, brushing her hands on her skirt. He chuckled low in his throat. "You planning to feed half the territory, just you," she said. "And the hens if you misbehave." He grinned, brushing a clump of dirt from her cheek with the soft pad of his thumb. She leaned into the touch, then tilted her chin toward the house. "I've been thinking about the upstairs room. The one with the view of the cottonwoods." "What about it?" he asked, standing. She rose beside him. "I want to turn it into a sitting room, somewhere to read, maybe keep some of the things I've been sewing." He studied her face. "You thinking of opening this place again?" "For boarders?" She shook her head. "No, I don't want strangers in the house anymore. I don't blame you. I want to fill it with things we use, things we keep." They walked back toward the porch, the grass damp underfoot. Inside, a kettle hissed on the stove. Foster poured water into the tin basin and washed his hands while she sliced bread from the fresh loaf cooling by the window. He dried his fingers on the hem of his shirt. "I got a letter yesterday." She looked over. "From who?" "My brother. He's back in Missouri running a freight stop near the Arkansas border. Says he's got more work than he can handle." Zadie turned to face him fully. "You thinking of going?" "I was," he said. "Before I came here." She didn't speak. Her fingers pressed into the heel of the bread. "I told him I was staying," Foster added. "Told him I finally found a place that didn't feel borrowed." Zadie's shoulders eased. "You want to write him back? I could give you paper." "I'd rather tell you about him," he said. "If you'll sit with me." They ate together at the kitchen table, and when the meal was done, she brought out the quilt again. Foster sat beside her, threading the needle, slow and clumsy but willing. "You ever think about children?" Zadie asked, eyes on the fabric. He paused. "I did once. Then I stopped, thought it wasn't in the cards." She nodded. "I think about it, not in a way that hurts anymore, just wondering if it might still happen." He set the needle down. "If it did, I'd want it to be with you." She met his eyes. "I want to build a life here," he said, "not just stay." "Build with you, however it looks." She reached over, placing her hand flat against his chest. "Then let's start." The next days passed in rhythm, planting, stitching, mending, waking beside each other as the sun filtered through the curtains. Foster repaired the kitchen door, hung shelves in the room Zadie had claimed for her sewing. She gathered wildflowers and pressed them into a book her mother had once used for hymns. Each night they sat on the porch as the light faded, her head on his shoulder. Their future stretched out not in grand plans, but in the quiet certainty of shared days. On a Sunday morning, the preacher from the next town rode in on a gray gelding, dust on his coat, a Bible wrapped in oilcloth. They stood beneath the cottonwoods behind the church, Foster in a clean shirt, Zadie with a ribbon at her wrist. There were no guests save for the wind and the birds and the elm that had once shaded her sorrow, now standing witness to something whole. After the preacher rode on, they stood alone in the tall grass, her hand in his. "You're sure?" she asked. Foster kissed her palm. "I've never been surer of anything." They walked home together, steps unhurried. He carried her over the threshold not because it was tradition, but because he wanted to, because she laughed when he did. And it filled the house with a sound that made every empty room feel full. That night they lay in the dark, her hand resting over his heart. He traced the curve of her spine beneath the quilt, and neither of them spoke. They didn't need words to know they were safe now. Seasons turned. The garden grew thick, and a cradle was carved from cedar in the back room, though they did not rush to fill it. They had time. They had each other. The house never held borders again. Just family. Just love. Just the kind of quiet that came after long grief, the kind built from tending and choosing and staying day after day. And when the wind moved through the cottonwoods, it no longer sounded like mourning. It sounded like home.